Everything you have trusted about life's fairness is suddenly overturned. What if the innocent suffer while the corrupt prosper? What if heaven itself grows quiet while you cry out in pain? I have seen this mystery written into the records, and the name that holds it is Job, for in his life the equation of reward and punishment dissolves, and what is left is the naked test of love itself. Not love for blessings, not love for prosperity, but love for the source without bargain or condition. And as I speak to you now, I can feel the vibration of that man's anguish, a resonance that still throbs in the soul of anyone who has ever asked in silence why the good must bleed while the wicked dance. Job's trial is not a fable to be entertained. It is a pattern of consciousness, a universal path each soul at some season must walk. And when I lay down in trance, the images come with a weight I cannot dismiss: deserts bathed in harsh gold, the ash heaps where a man sits scraping his sores, the thunder of silence between prayers and the absence of reply. These are not remote myths, they are mirrors set for you and for me. Imagine for a moment that everything defining your life was taken in a day: the family you cherished, the health you relied on, the possessions you built over decades, all swept into nothingness while you still breathe. This is no thought experiment for Job. It was his daily air. And yet the deepest lesson does not lie in the losses, but in the posture he held before them. The records show that Job fell to the ground not in curse, but in worship. The Lord gave, the Lord has taken away, blessed be the name of the Lord. Such words are not polished lines for a scribe, but the cry of a soul that still recognizes source even while shattered. When I interpret this vibration, I see the law being pressed into form, that faith tested without reward is the only faith that endures. For as long as we tether devotion to outcomes, our worship is no more than commerce, a trade masked in piety, but when devotion stands bare without reward, it shines as truth. You may think such devotion impossible. You may ask how a man of flesh and blood can utter blessing while burying his children. But the point is not that grief disappeared. The point is that grief itself was carried into God. The tears still fell, the robe was still torn, but even that tearing became an offering. I must tell you, suffering in this dimension is not only punishment nor accident. It is initiation, the furnace where motive is purified, where the soul learns whether it clings to God or to gifts. And Job's record is placed in Scripture not to frighten but to reveal the architecture of this furnace. In my readings, countless souls came asking why affliction had struck them, why health was stripped, why children were taken, and the same current flows back to Job, that the measure is not in the losses themselves, but in the posture of spirit before the losses. That is what defines the seed of eternity within us. You may feel abandoned when heaven is silent, but silence is not absence. Silence is the interval where your soul is weighed without interference, where your faith is allowed to declare itself without props. Job shows us that the silence of heaven is not cruelty, but confidence. God knew Job's love would hold, and so God permitted the test, not as a gamble, but as a revelation, a stage upon which devotion could be unveiled for all ages. I sense even now that many listening carry wounds, unanswered prayers, betrayals of fortune, and you wonder if there is meaning beneath the weight. Hear me. Job's story is your story written ahead of you, so that when your own season of stripping arrives, you may recognize that you are not cursed but called. His trial is not to be envied but to be understood, for it answers the most ancient accusation that no soul truly loves God without bribe, that devotion is always a mask for self-interest. And Job, by enduring, became the rebuttal for all humanity, proof that love for the source can exist without condition. Remember then, when you feel the silence, when prosperity collapses and health rots and prayers echo unanswered, remember Job's ash heap, for in that ash heap he became a witness not only of grief but of God, and his cry has been left to echo through centuries for you to find your own orientation. The records do not erase his pain, they preserve it, but they preserve also the deeper fact that faith can stand even when everything else falls, and in that standing is revealed the true wealth no calamity can steal. That is the beginning of Job's story, and it is the opening question for your own. Do you love because of gifts, or do you love because you know the giver? The land called Uz was not a legend. It was a place drawn upon the sands of ancient trade, a crossroads where caravans carried incense, copper, and stories, a region stretching east of the Jordan into what you know today as northern Arabia, southern Iraq, or the rocky reaches of Jordan. But more important than geography is the vibration I see when I read the records, for the earth itself holds memory, and the deserts where Job walked still carry the echo of his sorrow. The silence of the dunes is not emptiness but witness, as if creation remembers what human hearts forget, that a man once bore suffering so deep it became scripture. Scholars have argued for centuries over who wrote the book of Job. Some name Moses because of the ancient tone, others Solomon for the depth of wisdom. Many insist it was no single hand but a tapestry woven from oral tradition, each generation adding thread and flame, passing the story across firesides until at last it took the form you hold. Yet in the records the question of authorship is small beside the truth that the story itself insisted on survival. It refused to vanish. It clung to human memory because its pattern belongs to every soul. Job's world was not mystical mist, but a society where wealth meant herds, flocks, land, and servants, and his household was a fortress of prosperity, thousands of camels, oxen, and donkeys grazing on wide pastures, his children feasting together in their houses, his servants managing an estate that would have been the envy of any ruler. Yet more striking than his possessions was his practice of intercession, for at dawn he would rise to offer sacrifices for his children in case their hearts had strayed. And this detail reveals what prosperity often hides. That Job understood prosperity without devotion is fragile, that wealth is safer when consecrated to the source. I see in this habit a pattern for you, to cover not only your own path but those you love with prayer, to act not in fear but in awareness that consciousness shapes destiny. Job acted as priest in his household, ensuring that the spiritual roof was as strong as the material walls, and that is why his collapse would become such a scandal to his age, for the worldview of his neighbors was simple: blessing proves favor, suffering proves guilt, and when a man like Job falls, the entire logic of society cracks. In the culture of his time, wealth was seen as divine endorsement, calamity as judgment. This retribution theology gave comfort because it offered explanation, but it could not withstand the mystery that Job's story unfolded, that sometimes suffering is permitted not as punishment but as revelation, not as condemnation but as testimony, for God's ways do not fit into human arithmetic, and the book of Job stands as witness against shallow certainty. Consider how Job was introduced: blameless and upright, fearing God and shunning evil. His character was his true wealth, and his wealth was only the shadow of his alignment. His devotion was not mechanical, but heartfelt, and this is why the test could come. For only a vessel already filled with integrity can be emptied without collapsing. Only a tree with deep roots can endure the storm, and Job's life had been rooted in reverence long before the whirlwind touched him. The land of Uz itself mirrors this paradox. It was fertile in places and barren in others, a land of abundance and danger, where raiders could strike, where winds could rise suddenly, a place of prosperity always vulnerable to calamity. And such is the landscape of the soul, rich with gifts yet fragile under the weight of chance. The outer terrain of Job reflects the inner terrain of every human heart, precarious, blessed, exposed, and watched. When I read the Akashic stream, I see that Job's story is both cosmic and earthy. It does not float above history, but grows from the dust, showing that faith is tested not in temples alone, but in households, fields, and families, in the simple routines of sacrifice and labor, in the quiet choices of integrity that no one applauds. These are the foundations that make the soul ready when trial comes. The mystery of authorship, whether Moses, Solomon, or nameless voices, is a reminder that sometimes truth prefers to be anonymous. The absence of a signature keeps the eye upon God, not the scribe, for Job's life was never meant to glorify the teller, but to magnify the lesson. And so the story moves through time untouched by ownership, carrying the same vibration into every century, telling each generation the same unyielding truth, that suffering and faith are not opposites but companions, that prosperity is not proof, and calamity is not always condemnation, that the soul is weighed by devotion, not possessions. This is the foundation of Job's world, a land with trade and cattle, with ritual and family, with culture equating favor with fortune, and yet into that frame comes the disruption that will shake the assumptions of all who observe. For Job is about to prove that love of God is not a bargain but a reality, and before his trials unfold, it is vital to see the stage clearly, the man, the land, the culture, the devotion, so that when the storm comes, we understand the scale of what is at stake, not only for Job, but for the understanding of all mankind. That is why the land of Uz matters, not for its coordinates, but for its vibration, the resonance of a soul tested in the desert and recorded for eternity. The land called Uz was not a legend. It was a place drawn upon the sands of ancient trade, a crossroads where caravans carried incense, copper, and stories, a region stretching east of the Jordan into what you know today as northern Arabia, southern Iraq, or the rocky reaches of Jordan. But more important than geography is the vibration I see when I read the records. For the earth itself holds memory, and the deserts where Job walked still carry the echo of his sorrow. The silence of the dunes is not emptiness, but witness, as if creation remembers what human hearts forget, that a man once bore suffering so deep it became scripture. Scholars have argued for centuries over who wrote the book of Job. Some name Moses because of the ancient tone, others Solomon for the depth of wisdom. Many insist it was no single hand, but a tapestry woven from oral tradition, each generation adding thread and flame, passing the story across firesides until at last it took the form you hold. Yet in the records, the question of authorship is small beside the truth that the story itself insisted on survival. It refused to vanish. It clung to human memory because its pattern belongs to every soul. Job's world was not mystical mist, but a society where wealth meant herds, flocks, land, and servants. And his household was a fortress of prosperity, thousands of camels, oxen, and donkeys grazing on wide pastures, his children feasting together in their houses, his servants managing an estate that would have been the envy of any ruler. Yet more striking than his possessions was his practice of intercession, for at dawn he would rise to offer sacrifices for his children in case their hearts had strayed. And this detail reveals what prosperity often hides, that Job understood prosperity without devotion is fragile, that wealth is safer when consecrated to the source. I see in this habit a pattern for you, to cover not only your own path, but those you love with prayer, to act not in fear, but in awareness that consciousness shapes destiny. Job acted as priest in his household, ensuring that the spiritual roof was as strong as the material walls, and that is why his collapse would become such a scandal to his age, for the worldview of his neighbors was simple: blessing proves favor, suffering proves guilt, and when a man like Job falls, the entire logic of society cracks. In the culture of his time, wealth was seen as divine endorsement, calamity as judgment. This retribution theology gave comfort because it offered explanation, but it could not withstand the mystery that Job's story unfolded, that sometimes suffering is permitted not as punishment but as revelation, not as condemnation but as testimony. For God's ways do not fit into human arithmetic, and the book of Job stands as witness against shallow certainty. Consider how Job was introduced: blameless and upright, fearing God and shunning evil. His character was his true wealth, and his wealth was only the shadow of his alignment. His devotion was not mechanical but heartfelt, and this is why the test could come. For only a vessel already filled with integrity can be emptied without collapsing. Only a tree with deep roots can endure the storm, and Job's life had been rooted in reverence long before the whirlwind touched him. The land of Uz itself mirrors this paradox. It was fertile in places and barren in others, a land of abundance and danger, where raiders could strike, where winds could rise suddenly, a place of prosperity always vulnerable to calamity. And such is the landscape of the soul, rich with gifts, yet fragile under the weight of chance. The outer terrain of Job reflects the inner terrain of every human heart, precarious, blessed, exposed, and watched. When I read the Akashic stream, I see that Job's story is both cosmic and earthy. It does not float above history, but grows from the dust, showing that faith is tested not in temples alone, but in households, fields, and families, in the simple routines of sacrifice and labor, in the quiet choices of integrity that no one applauds. These are the foundations that make the soul ready when trial comes. The mystery of authorship, whether Moses, Solomon, or nameless voices, is a reminder that sometimes truth prefers to be anonymous. The absence of a signature keeps the eye upon God, not the scribe, for Job's life was never meant to glorify the teller, but to magnify the lesson. And so the story moves through time untouched by ownership, carrying the same vibration into every century, telling each generation the same unyielding truth, that suffering and faith are not opposites but companions, that prosperity is not proof, and calamity is not always condemnation, that the soul is weighed by devotion, not possessions. This is the foundation of Job's world, a land with trade and cattle, with ritual and family, with culture equating favor with fortune, and yet into that frame comes the disruption that will shake the assumptions of all who observe. For Job is about to prove that love of God is not a bargain, but a reality. And before his trials unfold, it is vital to see the stage clearly. The man, the land, the culture, the devotion, so that when the storm comes, we understand the scale of what is at stake, not only for Job, but for the understanding of all mankind. That is why the land of Uz matters, not for its coordinates, but for its vibration, the resonance of a soul tested in the desert and recorded for eternity. The court of heaven is not a myth, but a vibration I have often seen when the mind grows still and the records open. It is not bound by walls or thrones, yet it carries the gravity of order, a realm where all forces present themselves before the source, and in that assembly even the adversary must appear, not as an equal to God, but as an accuser permitted to test. And this is where Job's trial begins, not in the desert winds or the raids of nomads, but in the invisible dialogue that decides whether love is genuine when stripped bare. I see the hosts gathered, shining intelligences aligned with the will of the Creator, and among them enters Satan, the adversary, roaming the earth, watching, whispering, searching for weakness. His name means the accuser, and that is precisely his function, to challenge the integrity of man before God, to suggest that all devotion is nothing more than disguised self-interest. And when the Creator asks, "Have you considered my servant Job?" the accuser seizes the moment and replies with sharp scorn, "Does Job fear God for nothing? Is it not your hedge around him? Is it not your blessings that bind him? Strike all that he has, and he will curse you to your face." This exchange is not theater, but revelation. It exposes the most ancient suspicion lodged in human consciousness, the suspicion that worship is only commerce, that the soul praises because it profits. And God's answer is not to lecture, but to permit. Very well, all that he has is in your hands, but do not lay a finger on the man himself. Understand this. Permission is not abandonment. Boundaries are set. Evil is never sovereign. Even the adversary moves only within the limits God allows, and that is the first truth we must hold, that suffering, though real, never escapes the circumference of divine sovereignty. When I read this scene, I feel the weight of its meaning for every soul. For each of us is tested not by the things we cling to, but by the motive behind our clinging. Do we love the source for its own radiance, or only for the gifts that decorate our lives? And until that motive is exposed, it remains uncertain. So the test comes not as cruelty, but as unveiling, so that what lies hidden may be seen. Job's trial is cosmic in scope, yet personal in impact. For though the challenge is raised in the heavens, its blows fall in the fields and homes of earth. And here lies the paradox. Job never hears this conversation. He is never told of the wager. He suffers without the explanation the reader is given. And this is precisely why his faith is pure. For faith that knows all reasons is no longer faith but knowledge. And the soul is not measured by explanations, but by trust in the absence of them. I have often seen seekers cry out, "Why did this happen? Why was I struck down? Why was my child taken? And the record's reply is rarely a list of reasons, but a deeper truth, that you are being weighed for what cannot be seen, that your soul is being proven for what eternity requires, and so it was with Job. The heavenly court scene also shows us the nature of evil strategy, for Satan does not deny Job's goodness. He questions the foundation of that goodness. He implies that virtue cannot stand without reward, that all righteousness is bribed, and this accusation, if true, would unravel the whole design of creation. For if love is never more than transaction, then God is never truly loved, only used, and the entire meaning of existence collapses into barter. That is why Job's trial matters. It is not merely about one man's pain, but about the vindication of love itself, the proving that a soul can love without bargain, can trust without guarantee, can bow even when blessings vanish. I must speak plainly. Many who pray do so with hidden contracts. Heal me and I will serve. Prosper me and I will worship. Protect me and I will believe. But when loss arrives, the contract shreds and the devotion with it. This is why the adversary speaks with such confidence. He has seen countless souls collapse when the hedge is lifted, and he wagers that Job will be no different. Yet God's confidence in Job is not naive. It is grounded in the alignment Job has lived, a life of integrity, reverence, and intercession. And such a life, though still human, is strong enough to bear testing, so the permission is given, not as cruelty, but as a declaration of trust. For God trusts Job to reveal what faith truly is. In this heavenly courtroom, I also see a reflection of your own inner life. For within every person there is a stage where thoughts and impulses present themselves, where accusation rises, where faith must answer. The cosmic drama is mirrored in the psychology of each soul. You too are asked daily, do you love the source for itself or only for the hedge around your comfort? And each trial strips away illusion until the answer is revealed. This scene prepares us for the storm to follow, the raids, the fire, the wind, the losses that will gut Job's life. But remember always that behind the visible calamity there is an invisible boundary. The adversary may strike the possessions but not the man, later the body but not the life. And even in the fiercest test, the soul remains in God's hand. The wisdom here is fierce. Suffering is real, yet it is measured. Pain is crushing, yet it is permitted within a circumference of purpose. The adversary accuses but cannot define. God alone defines, and Job's trial will become the answer to the most ancient lie, that love cannot endure without bribe, that faith cannot stand without hedge. And as we follow Job through the ash heap, we must remember that this unseen court has already established the terms. God is sovereign, the adversary is limited, the soul, though wounded, is not abandoned, and love is about to prove itself in the most terrible yet most glorious way. This is the meaning of the unseen court, the beginning of the drama, and the revelation that suffering, though unexplainable to man, is never without boundary in God. The messengers did not arrive slowly. They came like thunderclaps, one after another, each carrying a blow that shattered Job's world more completely than the one before. And in this sequence of calamities lies a rhythm the records preserve, to show how swiftly fortune can collapse, how a life built across decades can be stripped in a single day, and how the soul is left naked before God without shield or hedge. The first breathless servant arrives, declaring that the oxen and donkeys have been raided, the herds driven off, and the servants slaughtered. Only he has escaped to tell the tale. Before that wound can even be grasped, a second bursts in. Fire from heaven has consumed the sheep and their keepers. Again, only one survivor remains to bear the weight of news. Then a third hurries in with word that the camels have been seized by raiders. More servants slain, more loss layered upon loss. And then comes the cruelest blow, the fourth messenger trembling as he tells that a mighty wind has collapsed the house where Job's children feasted, and none survived. 4 messages, 4 collapses, wealth gone, labor gone, livestock gone, children gone, and all in the span of moments, as if the universe had conspired to press the man into the dust. The records keep the silence that followed, the heaviness between words, the collapse of laughter into mourning. And in that silence, Job rises, rends his robe, shaves his head, and falls to the ground, not in rebellion, but in worship, saying with voice torn by grief, "The Lord gave, the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord." These words are not the denial of pain, they are the placement of pain within the sovereignty of God. For even as sorrow crushes him, Job does not lose orientation. He faces the source rather than cursing it. And this is why his response has endured across centuries as one of the purest declarations of faith ever spoken. Yet the adversary is not finished. For once more the heavenly court gathers, and once more Satan accuses, claiming that a man will give anything for his own life, skin for skin, strike his flesh, and he will surely curse you to your face. And God grants permission with boundary. Very well, he is in your hands, but spare his life. The second wave of testing strikes deeper than possessions. It invades the body itself, sores breaking out from crown to sole, his skin erupting in agony, his frame reduced to a shadow of itself, and Job takes a shard of pottery to scrape his wounds as he sits among ashes, a man once esteemed now unrecognizable, even to himself. Pain is not merely physical here. It is social and spiritual. For in his culture, affliction was read as judgment, and whispers would circle that Job must have sinned, must have offended God to deserve such torment. Humiliation layered upon agony, suspicion upon suffering. And as if this were not enough, his wife, broken with grief, turns on him with bitter despair. "Are you still holding fast to your integrity? Curse God and die." Her words have been judged harshly by many, yet they are the cry of a soul who has lost everything and cannot bear to see more. Her despair speaks what many have thought, that death is easier than fidelity in the face of endless pain. Job's answer is steady, though spoken through suffering. "You speak as one of the foolish women. Shall we accept good from God and not trouble?" And in this reply, the truth of unconditional faith shines. Not blind resignation, but recognition that God is sovereign over both plenty and pain, and that devotion cannot be based only on seasons of favor. Through all this, Job does not curse. Though he weeps and trembles, he does not turn against the source. And the text declares in all this, Job did not sin with his lips. This stage of his ordeal reveals the essence of the trial, that faith is not measured when skies are clear, but when storms strip the soul, that worship is not proven when blessings overflow, but when they vanish, and that trust is not shallow feeling, but rooted allegiance to the one who holds existence itself. The losses of possessions and family shattered Job's outer life. The affliction of his body tested his inner endurance. The despairing counsel of his wife pierced his heart. Yet still he clung to reverence. Still he placed his grief before God. Still he refused the easy curse. These scenes are written for every soul that suffers without explanation, for every heart that has asked in silence why calamity comes in waves. And the lesson is fierce but liberating, that even in the ashes the soul can orient itself toward the source, that even when stripped of all visible hedge, the invisible hand still holds, and that faith without reason, faith without reward, the faith without explanation, is the faith that endures. This is the meaning of Job's first ordeals, not to glorify suffering, but to expose the heart of devotion, to show the adversary's lie for what it is, and to reveal that love for God can survive the collapse of everything else. In the fury of loss, in the silence of heaven, in the ashes of agony, Job still bowed, and that bowing became the witness through which all generations may know that God can be loved, not for gifts, but for himself. Job sat in ashes, his body broken, his spirit crushed yet unyielding, and into this silence came his friends, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar, men who traveled from distant lands when they heard of his calamities, and at first their presence carried true compassion, for when they saw him from afar, they hardly recognized him. They lifted their voices and wept, tore their robes, sprinkled dust on their heads, and then sat with him on the ground for 7 days and 7 nights without speaking a word, because his grief was too great, and this silence was holy. An act of empathy deeper than speech, proof that sometimes the most powerful comfort is not explanation but presence. Yet silence cannot hold forever, and when Job at last broke with lament, cursing the day of his birth, longing that his existence be erased. His friends could not bear the rawness of his cry, and they rushed to defend God with words that became wounds. For each believed that suffering must follow sin, that calamity is punishment, that Job's ruin must mean guilt, and in their zeal to explain, they turned comfort into accusation. Eliphaz, the eldest, spoke first, appealing to experience and claiming that the innocent do not perish, that those who plow evil reap trouble. His tone framed as wisdom but carrying the sting of suspicion, suggesting that Job's losses were the fruit of hidden fault. And he even recounted a dream in which a spirit whispered that no mortal can be righteous before God, wielding truth like a blade. Half-light used to darken Job further. Bildad, harsher and bound to tradition, insisted that Job's children died because of their sin, and pressed that if Job were pure, God would restore him, his logic cold and merciless, reducing divine mystery to a formula of reward and punishment, stripping compassion away in favor of rigid doctrine. Zophar, youngest and most brash, cut deepest, declaring that Job deserved worse, that God had overlooked some of his sin, his words blunt, his counsel cruel, offering repentance as a mechanical solution, as if grief could be erased by a single confession. These speeches reveal not only the failure of friends, but the danger of shallow theology, for their words defended their worldview rather than Job's heart. They preferred a God they could predict to a mystery they could not explain, and in doing so, they misrepresented the very sovereignty they thought to protect. So much so that in the end, God himself would rebuke them. Job endured their accusations, yet he refused to yield his integrity. He did not accept their logic. He did not curse himself. He did not curse God. Instead, he cried out with honesty, demanding justice, declaring his innocence, wrestling not only with his pain, but with the very nature of divine order. And in this wrestling, he revealed a deeper faith than his friends who clung to formulas, for faith that cannot question is not strong but fragile. And Job's lament, though filled with anguish, was still directed to God, a testimony that even doubt can be a form of devotion when it refuses to turn away. The 7 days of silence and the torrent of words that followed remain a pattern written for all who suffer, for when calamity strikes, those around you may sit with you in grief, or they may rush to explain, but explanations without compassion become daggers, and the lesson is clear. Presence is greater than platitudes, empathy deeper than defense, and silence more sacred than speeches that misjudge. The friends mirror a human tendency to blame the sufferer, to maintain a sense of control by insisting that pain must be deserved. For if calamity is always caused by sin, then we feel safe, imagining it cannot strike us if we are righteous. Yet Job's story destroys this illusion, showing that suffering is not always punishment, that the righteous can suffer without guilt, and that God's purposes are higher than human arithmetic. This is why Job's friends failed. They could not accept a world where suffering did not fit their formula. They chose accusation over awe, logic over love, doctrine over presence, and so their counsel added torment to Job's agony. Yet within this failure lies a mirror for each of us, for how often have we spoken too soon into another's grief, offering explanations instead of listening, judgments instead of comfort, formulas instead of faith. And how often have we failed to see that what was needed was not our certainty but our companionship? Job's friends teach by contrast. Their first act of silence was wisdom, their later speech is folly, and this reversal is preserved to warn us that words meant to defend God can wound his servants, that theology without compassion misrepresents the very God it seeks to honor, and that presence without answers can carry more truth than explanations without love. As Job sat, torn between his agony and their accusations, the true trial deepened, not only against the adversary, but against the cruelty of those closest to him. And this stage of the story becomes universal, for every sufferer will meet voices that misjudge, and every faithful heart will face the temptation to collapse under the weight of false counsel. Yet Job endured, clinging to his integrity, refusing to confess guilt he did not carry, choosing to wrestle with God directly rather than accept the misrepresentations of his friends. This is the essence of part of his trial, that even when accused, even when abandoned by sympathy, the soul must stand in truth before God, for only God sees clearly, and only God's judgment matters, and Job's endurance in this tension prepared the way for the deeper revelations yet to come, when new voices would rise and at last God himself would speak. But for now, the lesson is anchored that in grief, silence is often holier than speech, compassion greater than correctness, and presence stronger than explanation. And Job's friends remind us by their failure of what true friendship must be. The debate grew harsher as Job's friends repeated their accusations, each bound by the same rigid creed that suffering must be the fruit of hidden guilt, and in their insistence they revealed more about their fear than about Job's condition. For men who need simple formulas cannot endure mystery. They cling to the idea that calamity is always deserved because it preserves their sense of safety. But Job refused their comfortless logic. He declared his innocence openly, and in doing so he placed himself in direct tension with God, for he was not content to be misjudged by men, nor to remain unanswered by heaven. Eliphaz spoke again, weaving visions of spirits, whispering that no man is pure, his words dressed in mysticism yet wielded as accusation. Bildad clung to tradition, pointing to the wisdom of the ancients and warning that the lamp of the wicked is snuffed out. Zophar sharpened his bluntness, insisting that Job was hiding iniquity and deserved worse than he had received, and together their cycle of speeches created a courtroom of condemnation, with Job seated as the accused, stripped not only of wealth and health, but now of dignity before his companions. Job answered not with silence, but with cries that cut through their charges. He demanded fairness. He called out for an audience with the Almighty. He longed for a written record of his defense, so that generations would know he was not guilty. And within these cries emerged one of the greatest affirmations of hope ever spoken. I know that my Redeemer lives, and that at the last he will stand upon the earth. Though my skin be destroyed, yet in my flesh I shall see God. Here Job's suffering became the soil of prophecy, despair giving birth to vision, lament flowering into faith beyond his own comprehension. His words swung between anguish and trust, at one moment longing for death, at another declaring, though he slay me, yet will I hope in him. And this paradox is the essence of the faithful heart, torn between the weight of agony and the stubborn insistence that God remains. Job embodied the mystery that faith can argue, protest, question, and still remain faith, for true trust is not the silence of the fearful, but the cry of the wounded who still believes someone listens. His friends grew weary, their arguments circling the same ground, and their inability to move beyond blame revealed their poverty, while Job's words, though ragged, carried a depth that echoed through eternity, for he was speaking not only for himself, but for all who suffer without cause, all who demand meaning when none is visible, all who cling to God, even when his presence is veiled. In these chapters, the adversary's wager is silently overturned, for Job does not curse, he argues, he laments, he longs, but he refuses to betray his devotion. And that refusal is the victory, for the test was never whether Job would smile through suffering, but whether he would remain turned toward God even when angry, and he did. And that turning is what silenced the accuser, though the friends never understood. I must tell you that Job's demand for a mediator, for one who could bridge the chasm between dust and divinity, is more than desperation. It is the seed of revelation. His spirit reached into the unseen and drew forth the outline of Christ, the Redeemer, who would one day stand on the earth. And this foresight shows how suffering can open the soul to visions hidden in ordinary times, how despair can widen the channel for prophecy, how pain can sharpen the eyes of the heart to glimpse truths not yet revealed. The friends, blind to this depth, kept returning to their shallow creed, and in this blindness they serve as a warning for every age. For when we reduce suffering to blame, we betray the mystery of God. When we trade compassion for explanation, we wound the broken. And when we cling to formulas, we misrepresent the sovereign who does not fit them. Job's companions thought themselves defenders of God, but in truth they became accusers of his servant, and in the end they would face divine rebuke for speaking folly. Job's speeches endure because they reveal the honesty of faith. He does not pretend, he does not hide his confusion, he does not polish his words for piety. He speaks with the voice of a man who has lost everything yet refuses to lose his connection to God. And that honesty is what gives his testimony authority, for it tells every sufferer that their cries are not foreign to heaven, that their questions are not rejected by God, that their laments can be prayers as surely as their praises. The struggle of these dialogues also shows the growth of Job himself, for while his friends stagnated in repetition, his soul stretched toward greater truths, his anguish refined into vision, his despair transformed into prophecy, his demand for justice lifted into a declaration of hope in a Redeemer. And this growth is the hidden fruit of his suffering, unseen yet profound, the transformation of his heart from knowledge by hearsay to knowledge by encounter, a preparation for the voice of God soon to thunder from the whirlwind. Until that moment, the dialogue circles, accusations rise, defenses are spoken, questions sharpen, but the lesson is already present, that suffering does not always mean guilt, that faith is not silence but honesty, that love for God can endure without hedge, and that the cries of the righteous, even when raw, are precious to the one who hears them. This stage of the story reminds us that human counsel often fails, but divine purpose never does, and Job's persistence in speaking to God directly rather than yielding to the misjudgment of his friends shows the path every soul must take, bypassing shallow explanations to reach the source, where questions may not be answered, but presence is assured, and in that assurance lies the true victory over despair. Elihu had been silent while the elders spoke, younger in years yet burning with conviction. And when the cycle of arguments between Job and his friends collapsed into repetition, he could no longer restrain himself, for he was angered that Job justified himself rather than God, and angered also that the friends had condemned without proving. So he rose with the passion of youth and the urgency of one who feels the Spirit pressing words into his mouth. His voice did not carry the bitterness of accusation nor the rigidity of tradition. Instead, he spoke with a fresh sharpness, declaring that wisdom does not belong only to the aged, that it is the breath of the Almighty which gives understanding. And in this statement, he pierced the illusion that experience alone guarantees truth, for true insight is gift, not accumulation. Elihu rebuked Job for exalting his innocence at the expense of divine justice, warning that in his complaints Job risked placing himself higher than God. Yet he also rebuked the friends for failing to answer Job's cries with clarity, pointing out that they had offered condemnation but no solution, words but no healing, doctrine but no revelation. He then shifted the vision of suffering itself, saying God does speak, now one way, now another, though man may not perceive it, in dreams, in visions of the night, in affliction, in warning, in discipline. In all these ways, God seeks to turn man from pride, to keep his soul from the pit, to preserve his life. And with this, Elihu reframed Job's ordeal, not as random cruelty nor as deserved punishment, but as divine communication, as a severe mercy meant to refine, to protect, to redirect, to teach. This view was unlike the simplistic formulas of the others, for he did not claim Job's guilt, nor insist on hidden sin. He suggested instead that pain could be a message, that suffering might serve purposes unseen, that affliction could be the voice of God calling the soul deeper. Elihu painted images of creation, the storm, the rain, the thunder, the wonders of nature that no man commands, and with these he prepared the stage for what was to come, for his words swelled like a prelude to the whirlwind, announcing that the Almighty is beyond human judgment, that his justice is never bent, that his wisdom governs all though men cannot trace it. He asked, "Do you know how the clouds hang poised? Do you understand the balance of the heavens?" Questions meant to humble but also to awaken awe, turning Job's focus from his sores to the vast order of creation, shifting attention from the ash heap to the sky. In this role, Elihu stands unique, for he does not accuse as the friends, nor does he despair as Job. He calls both sides upward, reminding Job that his laments, though honest, must not cross into self-righteousness, and reminding the friends that their condemnations lack truth. And this dual correction shows the impartiality of wisdom that seeks God rather than victory. His discourse revealed also a deeper law, that God is not silent, though men often fail to hear, that the Almighty bends, even suffering, into revelation, that affliction is not wasted, but can shape the soul into humility, drawing it away from destruction toward life. And this principle reaches beyond Job's story into every life, for many only awaken to divine presence through pain. Many only listen when stripped of distraction. Many only bow when their strength collapses. And Elihu's voice reminds us that even these dark passages are within the design of mercy. Job listened, and though he did not answer with the defiance he gave to his friends, his heart was being prepared, for Elihu's words softened the ground, lifting Job's gaze beyond complaint to awe, and this shift was essential, because what followed would not be another man's counsel, but the voice of God himself. Elihu's speeches, therefore, are more than interlude. They are transition, moving the narrative from human argument to divine encounter, from debate to revelation, from despair to perspective. He declared it is unthinkable that God would do wrong, that the Almighty would pervert justice. He proclaimed that his years are beyond number, his knowledge perfect, his control over creation absolute. And with these declarations, Elihu dissolved the false arguments that had weighed the dialogue down, cutting through the fog of accusation and self-defense with the reminder that God is always greater than our reasoning. In the records, the vibration of Elihu is fiery, youthful, sincere, sometimes severe, but charged with truth. And his role is to remind us that God does not need human defense, but human humility, that our suffering, though heavy, may be his message, and that our questions, though fierce, must remain within reverence. His words stand as a mirror for anyone who feels abandoned, urging that the silence of heaven may conceal instruction, that the storm itself may be the lesson, that the affliction which seems senseless may carry the very voice of God, if only the ear can discern it. Thus the story moves from Job's raw lament and the friend's weary accusations to Elihu's fresh voice, preparing the way for the Almighty to enter. And though Elihu fades, once the whirlwind speaks, his purpose is fulfilled, for he directs attention upward, clears the space of falsehood, and leaves Job's soul poised for revelation. His message remains that God is just, God is sovereign, God speaks in ways often missed, and that suffering, though bitter, may become a channel for wisdom, a furnace for humility, a doorway into awe. And in this doorway Job now stands, waiting for the voice that will answer, not with arguments, but with majesty. The storm gathered with a weight beyond weather, clouds thickened, winds rose, and out of the whirlwind came a voice not of man, but of the Almighty. Who is this that darkens counsel with words without knowledge? Brace yourself like a man. I will question you, and you shall answer me. And with those words, Job's lament was interrupted by revelation, not in the form of explanation, but in the form of majesty. For God did not argue about innocence or guilt. He unveiled creation itself as testimony, asking, "Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Who marked off its dimensions? Who shut in the sea with doors when it burst forth from the womb?" And these questions cascaded not to humiliate, but to reorient, reminding Job that the design of existence is far larger than his sorrow. Lightning, thunder, constellations, mountain goats giving birth, the lion's hunt, the raven's cry, all were summoned as evidence of God's order, a cosmos alive with wisdom far beyond human grasp. And with each image, Job's focus was lifted from his sores and ashes to the immensity of creation. And in that immensity his complaint shrank, not because his pain was dismissed, but because it was framed within a vastness he could not measure. The Almighty asked, "Have you commanded the morning? Have you entered the storehouses of snow? Do you know the laws of the heavens? Can you loosen Orion's belt?" And these questions cut to the root, showing Job that knowledge is limited, power is limited, perspective is limited, yet God's sovereignty is not. And the purpose of these words was not to provide an answer to why Job suffered, but to reveal the who that holds all answers. In that revelation lies the hidden cure, for despair grows in narrow focus, when the mind locks upon its wounds, but awe restores balance, when the soul remembers the scale of the Creator. And this is why God spoke from the whirlwind, not to explain, but to expand, not to justify, but to magnify, not to silence Job with force, but to quiet him with vision. Job had demanded a hearing, and he received it, but not in the courtroom he imagined, for instead of standing as plaintiff before a judge, he found himself a creature before the Creator, and this shift was the true resolution, not vindication of innocence, but revelation of sovereignty. His reply revealed the transformation. I know that you can do all things. No purpose of yours can be thwarted. I spoke of things I did not understand, things too wonderful for me to know. My ears had heard of you, but now my eyes have seen you. Therefore I repent in dust and ashes. These words are not confession of secret sin, but confession of awe, a surrender of demand, a recognition that the human mind cannot weigh the scales of eternity, and that peace comes not from explanation, but from encounter. The adversary had wagered that Job would curse, but instead Job bowed. The test was answered not by logic, but by posture, not by proof, but by worship. For in the ashes Job did not receive reasons, he received revelation, and that was enough. The whirlwind discourse teaches every soul that the silence of heaven is not absence, that when God speaks, it may not be with explanations, but with reminders of his majesty, and that those reminders are not cruelty, but mercy, because the heart healed by awe no longer demands reasons. It rests in trust. Consider how Job's journey turned from prosperity to ruin, from ruin to lament, from lament to defiance, from defiance to vision, and finally from vision to surrender. This arc is the path of every faithful soul. For suffering strips, questions rise, anger flares, hope flickers, and then at last the greater presence fills the void, and when that presence comes, the need for answers dissolves, for the soul finds that God himself is the answer. The voice from the storm is also warning, reminding man that knowledge does not grant control, that wisdom begins in humility, that the Creator governs even the wild beasts, even the stars, even the oceans, and that if such immensity is ordered by his hand, then human suffering, though incomprehensible, is not abandoned, but woven into a greater tapestry. In my readings, I have seen souls trapped in endless why, unable to move beyond the hunger for explanation. Yet the lesson of Job is that the why may never be given, but the who will be revealed, and when that who is revealed, the soul rests, for the knowledge of sovereignty outweighs the torment of mystery. The whirlwind is not spectacle, it is pedagogy, the teaching of scale, the reorientation of the finite before the infinite, and Job's final bow is the fruit of that teaching, a heart that no longer insists on controlling the narrative, a spirit that releases its demand to understand, a man who finds peace, not because his pain is explained, but because his God is exalted. This is the essence of Job's encounter, that explanations may soothe the mind, but only revelation heals the soul. And when God speaks, creation itself becomes the sermon, stars and storms the text, lions and ravens, the illustrations, and awe the conclusion. And in that conclusion, Job found what he sought. Not answers, but presence, not logic, but love, not justice defined on human terms, but justice contained in divine sovereignty. And this is why his story continues to instruct that when trials press us to the edge of despair, the path forward is not argument but orientation, not curse but bowing, not demand but surrender. For the voice from the whirlwind still speaks to any who will hear, reminding us that though we may not grasp the plan, we can trust the planner. And in that trust lies the true victory over the adversary, the world, and despair itself. Restoration came not as a bargain, but as a revelation. For after Job had prayed for his friends, the Lord restored his fortunes and gave him twice as much as before. And this act was not reward in the sense of wages, but fruit of faith that endured without transaction. And here lies the great truth, that God's justice is not mechanical but redemptive. He does not settle accounts as men do. He transforms ashes into beauty, despair into testimony, and brokenness into vision. The friends who had accused Job were commanded to seek his intercession, and in this reversal the divine hand revealed its subtle justice, for those who condemned were humbled, and the one condemned was lifted as priestly mediator, praying for the very voices that had wounded him, showing that the heart truly aligned with God does not cling to vengeance but offers forgiveness, and this forgiveness opened the door for renewal. Job's latter days were blessed with flocks, herds, sons, and daughters. His household filled again with laughter, yet even here there is mystery, for the new children did not erase the memory of the lost, and the new prosperity did not cancel the weight of past sorrow, but rather transfigured it, weaving grief into a deeper fabric of trust, showing that restoration is not replacement but transformation. The past is not undone but lifted into meaning within God's design. The record tells that Job's daughters were the most beautiful in the land, and that he gave them inheritance alongside their brothers, a radical act in that age. And this detail reveals how suffering had enlarged Job's sense of justice. He who endured affliction without cause now extended equity without hesitation, showing that true encounter with God reshapes how one deals with others. And thus the fruit of his trial was not only prosperity but character refined, compassion widened, integrity deepened. The story ends with Job living long, full of days, yet the real end lies not in his age but in his awareness. For he declared, "My ears had heard of you, but now my eyes have seen you." And this is the true resolution: not wealth restored, not family regained, but God encountered. For what the soul longs for most is not explanation, but presence, and once that presence is known, nothing can unsettle it. In my work, I have seen how souls pass through cycles of loss, sickness, doubt, and silence, and many ask why. Yet the lesson of Job whispers that the why is not the foundation, the who is, and that once you know the one who governs the storm, you can endure without needing every answer. For peace is not found in logic, but in surrender, not in explanation, but in trust. The accuser wagered that faith collapses without blessing, but Job's endurance proves the opposite, that true devotion clings to God even when stripped bare. And this proof is eternal. It resounds in every age, telling every sufferer that they are not alone, that their cries are not wasted, that their integrity matters, and that the God who seems silent is still weaving all into his design. The friends represent the voices of shallow counsel that persist in every age, those who rush to explain, to judge, to assign blame. Yet their folly was exposed when God rebuked them and upheld Job, showing that he values honesty over pious platitudes, truth of heart over correctness of speech, humility over dogma. And this remains warning for us, that when others suffer, our place is not to explain but to be present, not to accuse but to comfort. For only God knows the hidden purposes of pain. The arc of Job's journey reveals the stages of the soul: prosperity enjoyed, loss endured, lament poured out, accusations resisted, hope glimpsed, majesty revealed, and restoration granted. And this arc mirrors the path each soul must travel, for life is not free of sorrow, and faith is not proof against trial. But the divine promise holds that suffering can become seed of vision, that despair can be soil for revelation, that ashes can give birth to awe. Consider how Job's story ends, yet does not end. For though he was restored and lived full of days, the true continuation lies in us, in every generation that reads his words and finds voice for its own cries, in every soul that suffers without answer yet refuses to curse, in every heart that dares to hope in a Redeemer, in every seeker who bows, not because questions are answered, but because presence has been revealed. The lesson crystallizes here. Suffering is not always punishment. Silence is not absence. Restoration is not replacement. And faith is not denial. It is persistence. It is honesty. It is trust when reason fails. And in this persistence lies the victory over despair, over the adversary, over the temptation to curse. The story closes in the text, but it echoes in eternity, reminding us that the sovereignty of God is unshaken, that his justice, though mysterious, is never perverted, that his mercy, though hidden, is never absent, and that his purposes, though veiled, are always moving toward redemption. This is the lingering resonance that Job's life stands as testimony not to a man's patience but to God's faithfulness, and that what seemed like ruin became revelation, what seemed like silence became speech, what seemed like injustice became unveiling, and what seemed like death became doorway to deeper vision. In your own trial, remember this: the whirlwind still speaks, the Redeemer still lives, and the God who restored Job still carries his children through storms. Not always with explanations, not always with immediate relief, but always with presence, and in that presence lies the peace that surpasses understanding. Let this awareness remain, that Job's ashes became altar, his cries became scripture, his wounds became witness, and his story became mirror for all who suffer. And in that mirror we see our own reflection, not as abandoned but as accompanied, not as forgotten but as held. And in that holding we find the strength to endure, to hope, to trust, until restoration in its many forms arrives, whether in this age or the one to come, for the Redeemer who Job foresaw stands still, and in him all storms are answered.